Welcome back to another one of my videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. My name is Lotta, and today I'm going to show you how to make this Prinzregententorte. Now, on a previous video of mine, I was asked if I could make this cake, and to be honest, I never thought I would ever be making it because it just has way too many layers and it's so intricate, and I just have so much respect for it. But because you asked me to make it, here you go. Now, this cake does have a little bit of history to it. So it was first created in 1886 for the 65th birthday of Prince Regent Luitpold of Bavaria, and it consisted of 8 thin layers of sponge cake that were each layered with a thin layer of German chocolate buttercream and then topped with a chocolate glaze. Now, the 8 layers are significant because it represents the 8 districts of the Kingdom of Bavaria at the time. Now, post-World War II, one of the districts actually got split off, so nowadays it's typically made with 7 layers instead of the 8 layers. But personally, I find 1 layer more or less doesn't really matter too much. Now, without further ado, let's get right into the video. Now we're going to start by making our sponge cake so we can get our individual sponge layers baked and cooled off. So for that, you're going to need 7 room temperature eggs. My eggs are pretty small, so if you have really big eggs, you can probably just get away with just using 6. You're also going to need 150 grams of sugar with a pinch of salt. I'm also adding 1 package of vanilla sugar, but you can just as easily use vanilla extract. And last but not least, you're going to need 140 grams of flour. Now, the ingredients to this sponge cake are slightly different than the one that I make for all of my other cakes, but the procedure is pretty much the same. We're basically just going to whisk together our eggs, sugar, salt, and vanilla until that is super light and fluffy and you can't feel any more sugar in between your fingers. Now that our eggs are super fluffy like this, we can sieve in our dry ingredients. Now, I like doing this in 2 batches, that way it keeps as much fluffiness as it can. Now, I already went ahead and prepped my baking sheets. So all I did for that was trace a circle on the back of my parchment paper that's roughly 25 centimeters in diameter. And that's going to help make sure that all of our sponge layers are nice and even and roughly the same shape. That being said, I also have some of these reusable mats, but because I can't draw on the back of these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of my parchment paper as like a guide. That's why I try to trace it really thick on the back so I could see it through my mat. Now, essentially all we're going to do is add about 1 cup of our sponge dough onto each of our parchment papers, and we're going to spread that out as evenly as we can just past our little circle sketch. That way we have a little bit of wiggle room and they're not going to be too small, because it's better to be slightly too big than too small. And then we're going to bake 2 of our layers at a time in the oven that's been preheated to 180 degrees Celsius or 360 degrees Fahrenheit for about 8 to 10 minutes. Now, you basically just want to make sure that they're nice and golden brown, and because they're so thin, they're going to bake rather quickly, so just kind of keep an eye on it. Now that all of our sponge cakes are baked and completely cooled off, we can cut them to the right size. Now I'm just going to use my cake ring and adjust it to 24 centimeters. And I'm just going to press it into each of my cake layers and then get rid of all the excess around the edges. Now for the chocolate buttercream, we're using a German buttercream recipe. So I already made a video on my channel on this step-by-step on how I make my German buttercream. If you want to see that, it's up there. But essentially, I already went ahead and cooked one chocolate pudding, just with the instructions on the back, except that I used 200 milliliters of heavy cream and 300 milliliters of milk instead of just 500 milliliters of milk. So our pudding is completely cooled off to room temperature, and I've also got 250 grams of butter that is also at room temperature. Now again, you want to make sure that both things are at room temperature to get a really nice smooth buttercream consistency, because if your butter is too soft or too cold, it's not going to whip up the way that you want it to. Same with your pudding. That being said, you also don't need to use a prepackaged chocolate pudding mix like I did. You can also always go ahead and make your own chocolate pudding from scratch, as long as you use about 500 milliliters of liquid. Now the German buttercream is super easy to make. Essentially all we're going to do is whisk up our butter until it's super light and fluffy, and in the meantime we're going to sieve our pudding to make sure that any lumps that are in our pudding quickly get removed, and that's going to let us get a super smooth, creamy buttercream. Now that our butter is super nice and fluffy, we're going to start adding little dollops of our chocolate pudding and mixing that in one dollop at a time. Now at this point, you also want to give your chocolate buttercream a quick taste to see if it's chocolatey enough for you or if you need to add a little bit more chocolate. In my case, I'm going to add an additional 50 grams of melted chocolate to it, but you can just as easily add some cocoa powder as well. Now just to make sure that my chocolate mixes in with my buttercream, I'm going to add a couple dollops of my buttercream and mix it in with my chocolate first before transferring everything over. Now I like the taste of my chocolate buttercream the way it is now, so I'm going to leave it at that, but you can always add in more melted chocolate or more cocoa powder if you like. One thing that can happen is if you add a lot of your warm melted chocolate, it can really thin out and smooth out your buttercream. So if you find that it's just too smooth and it's not quite holding its shape, stick it into the fridge for 20-30 minutes to let it cool down and then whisk it up again, and that should fix that problem. And the same goes vice versa. If you find that your buttercream is too thick, it's not really smooth, it's not spreading as easily, take out a little bit of it, heat it up in the microwave until it's nice and melted, and then whisk it back in with the rest of your buttercream, and that should help smooth that out. The key is really just tempering your buttercream until you get like a really nice spreadable consistency that's not too smooth and not too thick. Now at this point we can also get to layering our cake. So all of our sponge cakes are already cut out behind me, and our buttercream is ready to go as well. Now the hardest part is getting your really thin sponge layers off of your parchment paper without anything kind of sticking to it. So I find it really helps to use a little spatula like this, or a sharp knife, or even something like this to kind of carefully go along the edges to try and loosen it from your parchment paper before you try taking it off. Now basically all we're going to do is add one layer of our sponge cake, add a part of our buttercream and smooth that out nice and straight, and then repeat that with all 7 layers. Now you just want to make sure that you save enough buttercream to cover the edges and the top. That way our glaze is going to have a nice smooth surface to run off of, and it's going to look really beautiful. Now if you find it a little bit difficult to get nice even buttercream layers, you can always take out 6 or 7 tablespoons of your buttercream and just set that aside for doing your edges. And everything else that you have left, you can divvy up into 7 even bowls and use each bowl as one of your buttercream layers. That way it's guaranteed to be quite even. That being said, I'm just going to eyeball it because I don't really care if my layers aren't 100% even. Plus I just don't want to do all those dishes. But you do what you want to do. Now our cake needs to go into the fridge for at least 2 hours in order to completely cool off before we add our glaze on top. Now I'm just going to leave it in the fridge overnight, and then I'm going to finish it in the morning. It's the next day and we can finally finish our cake. Now the last thing we need to do today is make our chocolate glaze that's going to be poured all over our chilled cake, and it's going to leave a nice smooth chocolatey surface. Now for the chocolate glaze, you're going to need 300 grams of dark chocolate as well as 1 tablespoon of oil. I'm using coconut oil. Now essentially all we're going to do is heat this over a water bath until it's nice and liquid and melted before we let it cool off ever so slightly before pouring it over our cake. Now remember, with your water bath, you don't want the water touching the bottom of your bowl, and you also don't want the water to boil because that'll overheat your chocolate. You just want it to be nice and warm. Now I already went ahead and transferred my chilled cake onto a wired rack, and that's just going to help make glazing a little less messy. Now essentially all we're doing is pouring our melted chocolate all over our cake and quickly smoothing it out. Now because our cake is chilled, it's also going to make our chocolate thicken up quite fast, so you want to work relatively quickly. I'm going to let the chocolate set for about 5 minutes before I carefully transfer it off my wire rack onto my serving platter. And don't forget to repurpose all of your chocolate that's left over. Now at this point, our cake can wander back into the fridge to set completely. Now you can leave your cake just like this, or you can use your leftover buttercream or some whipped cream to do a little bit of piping on top. And there you have our 7-layer Prinzregententorte. So that's going to be everything for today's video. If you enjoyed it, you can give it a thumbs up or write me a comment down below. And as always, the whole recipe is going to be in the description box as well. And if you have a cake that you would like to see me make, let me know in the comments as well, and your cake might be the next cake that I make. Now without further ado, let's cut right into this cake and see what it looks like from the inside. Now my sponge cake layers could have been a little bit thicker, but I think for my first try it turned out pretty good, and it tastes really good too.